not want to recognize this truth because it does not suit their particular perception. As Lieutenant Colonel John Alexander, the man who was instrumental in Vice President Gore's defeat of Ross Perot in the televised debate on NAFTA, said, and I quote, "There are still people who believe the earth is flat," end of quote. Alexander is absolutely correct. One of the specialists who should know about mind control is Harlan E. Girard, who delivered a paper on the subject to the NATO-sponsored Advanced Research Workshop on Coherent and Emergent Phenomena in Biomolecular Systems, held at the University of Arizona, January 15th through 19th, 1991. The basic premise of Girard's paper was that the United States has developed a system that can look at the human mind, utilizing gigahertz radiation pulsed at low frequencies, ELF, that can convey commands to the targeted subject, which he or she will carry out. This is not new. The Soviet scientist V.I. Vernadsky and his protege A.G. Gurvich were working on mind control systems as early as 1934. Vernadsky's star pupil, Professor Vladimir Krasnichev, took Gurvich's work a great deal further, as did another Russian scientist, E.P. Velikhov, of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Krasnichev did hundreds of experiments for the Russian military, using electromagnetic energy for the pathogenic actions of viruses, and drugs, such as cocaine, using electromagnetic energy to transmit the substances, many of which were deadly poisons. Krasnichev proved that it is possible to cause whole population groups to become addicted to cocaine by simple electromagnetic induction of the substance from long distances. Over 21 institutions in the then USSR worked on a wide variety of programs for military purposes and also for the purposes of mind control. The scientists use psychotropic drugs, including LSD, cocaine, a variety of uppers and downers, and electrical stimulation of specific areas of the brain, which prove that when minute currents of electromagnetic energy are introduced into the brain, profound changes occur. Thus were the so-called, quote, deep secrets, unquote, of the brain probed and uncovered. The results of the experiments enhanced techniques for sophisticated mind control, and in addition, a whole new range of electromagnetic weapons were produced for the Russian military. Since the 1970s, Russian scientists have been working on perfecting a system that allows mind control from the outside without implanted electrodes or drugs through the external application of electromagnetic energy. Krasnichev proved literally hundreds of times that the internal brain waves, EEG, would and could be entrained by this method. With various modifications, it was demonstrated that direct transfer of information to the brain could be carried out through radio frequency waves, suitably modulated, at levels that were not lethal. Such tailored electromagnetic signals cannot be stopped, and technically at least, it was possible to direct the mind of the subject to carry out any kind of order, even an order to murder a colleague. In America, Dr. Jose Delgado, using monkeys, achieved much the same results as the Russian scientists. The absorbed power levels were less than 1/1000th of a watt per square centimeter. The fact that the CIA, and more likely also the United States military, have this equipment does not surprise me in the least. These devices are fully capable of producing thousands of Manchurian candidates, while Russian scientists fine-tuning use limits below the fatal threshold. The United States scientists have no such techniques. This gives rise to the possibility that some people die as a result of application of electromagnetic fields to the brain, which calls for greater control over autopsies on people who die from unknown causes. Your doctor should be made aware of the distinct possibility of death by electromagnetic brain interference, so that if anything untoward should happen, the possibility will not be overlooked. What I am saying is that in the American equipment there is no allowance made for lethal thresholds of electromagnetic waves coursing through a human brain. As few, if any, of the subjects are asked for their permission for such experiments, and maybe in prison population, for example, the need for an oversight committee to supervise this kind of conduct has become overpowering. Dr. Jose Delgado, one of America's pioneers in mind control, says, and I quote, "Physical control of many brain functions is a demonstrated fact. It is even possible to follow intentions, the development of thought and visual experiences." Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was one of the CIA's consultants working on the MK Ultra program, told the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research that the CIA required him to find, and I quote, "techniques of activation of human organisms by remote control electronic means," end of the quote. Dr. Gottlieb did not spell out the words mind control, but those in the hearing room on that morning of September the 27th, 1977, were fully aware of what he was talking about. When President Reagan was elected to office, the National Security Agency, NSA, went to work to devise ways and means of dealing with White House enemies. One such program, a form of mind control, was codenamed Dakota. Dakota was not enough to stop John Hinckley's attempted assassination of Reagan in March of 1991, during which Brady was shot. Was the attempted assassination a mind control experiment for which Hinckley was selected? Certainly there is a mountain of evidence to suggest that, at the very least, Hinckley was hypnotized, and then after being on hold, and that's a quotation, was told to kill Reagan. The telephone call trigger is today almost obsolete. The famous Dr. Milton Erickson, who developed the confusion technique, which induces a trance-like state of mind, may even have been involved, although there is no evidence that I could find to prove my theory. The confusion hypnotism technique works like this. Give the targeted person so much to deal with in an ultra-short period of time so that he has no time to deal with anything on his own. One thing after another is thrown at the subject, after which the focus is constantly shifted until the subject shows signs of collapse. At this point, the hypnotist provided some relief, some instruction, and the subject immediately goes into a deep trance. Perhaps this is the way Hinckley was handled. It is absolutely possible that his subconscious memory stored the helpful suggestion, quotation, of the hypnotist. This could have been, go out and shoot the president, for example. Although, as I said, I have not found any evidence that this is what happened. But that does not mean the possibility ought to be excluded. In fact, the opposite is true. There have been a number of reports in the national media which seem to lend support to the theories that abound on mind control. In a May 24th, 1984 story carried by the Miami Herald about James Pettit, a former CIA pilot who claimed to be a victim of the CIA's Operation Crystal Ball, Pettit was certain that he had been given a mind control implant while he was a patient at the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research in San Antonio, Texas, during April of 1982. In parentheses, hospital records show that Pettit did not leave the hospital until July the 2nd, 1982. Pettit maintained that he was being subjected to mind control through this device, which a subsequent X-ray photograph showed was implanted just behind his left ear. Pettit told newspaper reporters that he believed the CIA wanted to use him, and I quote, to assassinate someone. It would be a good idea to check Sirhan to see if he has implants. James Earl Ray and John Hinckley should be checked too, said Pettit. In the light of these things, Harlan Gerard seems to have a point when he mentions in his paper, and I quote, the purpose of mind-altering techniques is to create one or more of several different possible states in the conscious or unconscious area of the brain. The ultimate goal of controlled offensive behavior might well be the submission of one's will to some outside force. End of the quote. Implants are no longer necessary, having been supplanted by gigahertz frequency maser, radiotronic and electromagnetic beam weapons. In his book, The Technotronic Era, Brzezinski makes reference to the time when a certain class of people who appear to be normal people but who are not will be on the scene. He envisaged a future where the Committee of 300 would have the ability to control every person on Earth through means of mind control and what he called, quote, technotronics, unquote. This would produce human-like robots and a system of terror that would be needed to govern the world. And I'll quote further from his book. This will encourage tendencies through the next several decades toward a technotronic era, a dictatorship, leaving even less room for political procedures as we know them. Finally, looking ahead to the end of the century, the possibility of biochemical mind control and genetic tinkering with man, including beings which will function like men and reason like them as well, could give rise to some difficult questions. End of the quote from Brzezinski's book. Today, these beings exist, and they are called automans, A-U-T-O-M-A-N-S. With this in mind, the abstract that the United States has the ability and has actually created automans, slaves who will do the bidding of the mind controllers, the so-called Manchurian candidate, is not as far-fetched as at first sight. In his book, Microwave Auditory Effects and Applications, Dr. James C. Lynn explains the technology and the manner in which subjects receive instructions. The continued use of these electromagnetic waves can drive a normal person absolutely insane. Lynn says there is no doubt that, and I quote, voices can tell a programmed assassin to kill. Such messages are broadcast directly to the brain via bone induction and cannot be blocked. In the early part of 1960, Dr. Joseph C. Sharp volunteered for tests involving mind control, which were carried out at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Dr. Sharp stated that he could hear and undertook commands sent to him in an echo-free isolation chamber via a pulsed electromagnetic wave that went directly to his brain. It may well be that much of the random shootings that have occurred so conveniently at the time of heightened agitation for gun control were carried out by programmed Manchurian candidates, and we shall return to that later. In years past, there have been crude attempts to interfere with the functions of the brain, such as were conducted for years by the demented Dr. Stuart Cameron. This cold-blooded destroyer of hundreds of perfectly good minds was a close friend of the late Allen Dulles, while Dulles was the head of the CIA. Dulles had always been obsessed with mind control, and he followed his interest to extremes, often pouring billions of dollars into different projects where he thought the money would do the most good. Apart from Cameron, another of his protégés was Dr. Harold Wolff, who worked for the Cornell University before Dulles recruited him to work for the CIA. Also on the team of mind-controlled experts were Dr. Joseph Hinsey, Dr. Lawrence Hinckley, Professor George Kelly of the Psychiatric Department of the Ohio State University, and Professor Barnaby Keeney of Brown University. Cameron did experiments for the CIA in sensory deprivation, which included the irreversible scrambling of a patient's mind. A cold, sadistic beast of a man, Cameron was just right for his appointed task of obliterating minds, all in the name of mind control. In the 1960s, mind control in America had not yet reached the heights achieved by the Russians. We were still experimenting with narco-hypnotic techniques. Some of these drugs could affect the thyroid so badly that the victim would become almost an imbecile. Laboratories like Sandoz, Hoffmann-La-Roche, Eli Lilly were producing drugs that were ideal for mind control. Some of these drugs are listed at the end of this work. The United States intelligence agencies studied the effects of isolating a prisoner in total darkness. This often produced horrible hallucinations. But all of these dreadful experiments fell far short of what Russian scientists were doing, sending messages by electromagnetic pulsed waves, telling a subject who was at a distant location exactly what he had to do. It might be appropriate at this point to list some of the mind control experiments carried out by the CIA on involuntary subjects, that is, prison inmates, ill-informed persons, and even servicemen. These took the following forms: electronic brain stimulation, brain concussion, hypnosis, electric shock treatment, stress, psychosurgery, brain implants, radio frequency broadcasts, ELF radiation, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive applications, and deep sleep therapy. In addition, a whole series of drugs were used in differing combinations and with a variety of other, quote, treatments, unquote. The list of drugs used rivals the content of an average pharmacy. There was no one to protect the victims of this unbridled terror, many of whom were driven insane. The purpose of these experiments were perfectly clear. They were done in the context of the one world government command that all men must be subjugated when the time comes. The rulers talked about by Brzezinski must have the means at their disposal to strip individuals of their willpower who might want to resist them. Bear in mind that what can be done on an individual basis can also be done nationally and internationally, as we shall see. To this end, we can turn to less sinister devices and methods, which are, however, very effective. I particularly think of television, that piece of equipment that sits in almost every home, certainly in the Western world. Television is generally regarded in a friendly manner by the uninformed. But is it? Just how much do we know about how it is being used as a mind control weapon against the unsuspecting? Dr. Ernst Hilgard, a well-respected hypnotist, said, and I quote, "Sitting quietly with no sensory inputs apart from the television screen is itself capable of getting people to set aside ordinary reality, allowing the substitution of some other reality that the television set may offer. You can get so imaginatively involved that alternatives temporarily fade away," end of the quote. Other experts have proved that the more we are drowned in a sea of television ads, the less we notice them, and the more we are affected by them. Our minds become receptacles for vast amounts of detail, and we are then easy subjects for government to program by projecting images it deems desirable right into our homes. It is not that there haven't been any messengers crying in the wilderness about the dangers of being brainwashed by television. There have been many books written about subliminal messages and how such messages are got across. Mostly, the warnings and explanations of how subliminal messages work were ignored, most of the time out of sheer disbelief. One of the most prominent messengers who warned about the evils of subliminal messages was Dr. Wilson Bryan Key. Others, like Dr. Hal C. Becker, proved in a series of experiments that it is possible to get information to the brain without the targeted person ever knowing about it. Such inner directional conditioning was perfected by the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, using a technique known as long-range penetration. With these two methods, it is absolutely possible to program an entire nation and turn that nation away from its intended course of action. The technique can be very successfully applied to individuals with leadership capacity with the same results. Using these methods, the population of the United States was inflamed against President Saddam Hussein and the people of Iraq in an astonishingly short space of time. The medium used in this instance was television, but it could have been done by several other methods, including electromagnetic transmissions and satellite transmissions. I know it has happened to me, and I'm sure that you too have experienced falling asleep in front of your television set for apparently no reason. Well, that is not quite correct. There is a reason. In the United States, television viewing is a process of almost constant interruptions. We know these as commercials, which can be of 30 to 120-second duration. In the course of an evening's viewing, I counted 600 commercials, all of them filling my mind with just as many different messages. It is not therefore unusual that the mind begins to go into a sort of lethargic state. It simply cannot absorb all of the messages. What happens when you turn the volume down? The answer is that you sit staring at the screen and the messages still continue to hit your brain, sound or no sound. It is not long before you begin to feel sleepy and you doze off. Millions of people in America do this every night. But here is the horror. They are still getting the messages because in their relaxed, passive state, they become excellent receivers. Today there are instruments that can and do mechanically enhance subliminal perception. A film projector flashing a message every 5 seconds at 1/3000th of a second is one such device currently in use. Speeds can be varied to achieve different results. The device is not new, having been patented in 1962. Newer light intensity instruments have done away with a projector image. Today's light intensity projector works beneath the level of the consciousness. The eye cannot pick up, but the message is received directly by the unconscious mind. As far as back as 1966, Dr. Hal Becker's patented subliminal induction devices, which he demonstrated could introduce images to the brain without the subject being consciously aware of what was happening. I recall sitting in the first-class lounge in Kennedy Airport many years ago. There was time to spare, so in common with about a dozen passengers, I watched television, which meant intaking ads on every level. Having been conditioned to United States television, I thought little of the multitude of ads offering cures for constipation, bad breath, foot odor, and every conceivable human condition. But when an ad appeared for tampons, the man next to me leapt to his feet and said in a loud voice, "My God, nothing is sacred anymore in America." He was from a small town in Switzerland and was horrified by the ultra-personal nature of the images on the screen. We saw everything from cleaning stuff for toilet bowls to lotions to eradicate underarm odor, and it dawned on me, this man is right. How could we just sit there and stare at things that were not polite even to mention in company just a short while ago, which we now accept as normal conduct? That is brainwashing. We are programmed to assimilate product brand names that have instant recognition when we go shopping in our favorite supermarket. Television has become a soporific in that we cannot possibly take in all that is thrown at us in the course of an evening's television watching. What happens? We fall asleep, but that does not stop the messages from getting through to our unconscious minds. Such advertising has the power to cause the very ailment that ad for product X says can be cured. This technique was discovered by John Rawlings Rees of the Tavistock Institute. For instance, if counseling removed the maladjustment, differently directed counseling would make the subject ill. So it was with ads for toothache remedies. When accompanied by heavy, repetitive music, at least 15% of the viewing audiences began to get toothache, or so they thought. The same kind of reaction was invoked in audiences who watched ads for tempting foods. Fully 15% of the viewing audiences went looking for the product, or they ordered it within the next few hours. Pizza sales always boom after a pizza commercial. The United States is the most television-saturated country in the world, which means that we are also the most easily controlled. Our culture is a television culture. We believe what we see on television. This comes out when the government wants to take action that has not been sanctioned by the other branches of our system. Government will invariably turn to television to get it out of a dilemma. Once we deteriorate to the level where we are mentally dazed by all that is happening around us and not really able to grasp it, we resort to apathy as a way out. In this state of mind, the government makes great strides towards totalitarianism. We are so rooted in the ritual of obedience to government that even when we see examples of dictatorial conduct right in front of our eyes, we barely bestir ourselves to protest it. Yet we bristle and wax indignant at the very idea that we are a controlled nation. Those few rules that government would have us believe are necessary for a well-ordered society proliferate until the point is reached where we will not protest layer upon layer of additional rules for supposedly our well-being. The Irish have the best attitude. If there is a government, I am against it. Consider the following. For years I've been trying to shed the light of truth on the Gulf War and how it was the greed of the major oil companies that precipitated it. Americans, by and large, had never even heard of Saddam Hussein and the Kurds. I venture to suggest that before Desert Storm, the American people had at best only a hazy idea of who the Kurds were. Now we have a situation where the United States daily perpetrates acts of war by flying war planes over Iraq. We are told this is to protect our allies, meaning the Kurds, from the murderous attacks of the Iraq army. To prove the point that we have to stand guard against Hussein, lest he indulge in further acts of terrorism against, quote, his own Kurdish population, unquote, ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN dinned into our heads as fact that during the Iraq-Iran war, Hussein had ordered a nerve gas attack on the Kurdish village of Halabja. Graphic pictures of dead Kurds were screened alongside Iraqi nerve gas shells. That's a quote. That supposedly had killed innocent Kurds. We were told that the nerve gas attack on the Kurdish village of Halabja was, quote, a brutal revenge attack on the Kurds for supporting advancing Iranian troops, end of the quote. What was the real story? The type of gas that killed the Kurdish civilians was phosgene. Every manual in the world listing the types of weapons, including CAB weapons used in the Iran-Iraq war, state that the Iraq military has never had phosgene gas in its arsenal, while the same manuals listed phosgene in the arsenal of the Iranian army. A February 1990 report issued by the U.S. War College stated that Iraq was not responsible for the attack on Halabja and concluded, and I will quote, "It was an Iranian bombardment that actually killed the Kurds."